Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today our analyst will be counting down the top 10 items for patch 10.23. There were no item changes in the latest patch, so it's a great time for us to talk about the top items in the meta. Overall, there's a good amount of choices when it comes to items, with a wide variety being situationally viable. With all that said, let's jump on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off today's list, we have Bramble Vest coming in at number 10. Bramble Vest has become a solid option in the defensive item meta, mainly because a lot of carry champions use Infinity Edge. Or if they don't use Infinity Edge, they're an assassin, which Bramble Vest is very good against. That said, it's not a completely necessary item to make, so it mainly depends on what your composition's goal is going to be. If you're running a weak frontline, it's easy to get overrun against enemy ranged carries, especially if they're running someone like Ashe or Jhin with an IE. That's where Bramble Vest comes in handy to keep your frontline from getting instantly bursted down. Bramble Vest is also quite good on champions like Riven, Diana, or even Kayn because you want them to survive as long as possible. There can be some merit to running Bramble on your ranged carry if you're going against a lot of Talon players, as the new targeting parameters of Talon's ability means he attacks high armor targets. And when he does, Bramble will keep your carry from getting criticaled. Generally, one chain vest is enough against Talon, but it's worth keeping in mind running Bramble if needed. Let's move on to the next item on our list. The number 9 item is Ludens Echo. When Static Shiv got buffed to ridiculous proportions, it seemed that maybe Ludens would follow suit. After all, they were buffed in similar ways. But Ludens, being a magical damage item, wasn't as overpowered as Shiv and thus hasn't taken over the meta in the same way. There are times, though, that Luden is quite good. Early game, for instance, is one of the best times to slam a Ludens because it does quite a bit of damage, especially if you're running it on a CC champion like Nami. Later on in the game, it definitely falls off, but keep in mind, it will proc the extra damage on any form of CC, which means it's decent on Dazzler champions since the debuff counts as crowd control. Hands down, the best use of Ludens, and the reason why it's in our top 10, is when you give it to Nami in a Nami-focused comp. With just one Ludens, the amount of damage that Nami can do is quite a lot considering she's a one-cost champion. When you 3-star her and play additional Enlighten units with her, she is going to basically be a machine gun shooting your bubbles, which all proc Ludens damage. While this is a relatively niche use of Ludens Echo, it's still strong enough considering Nami is part of the meta. Sure, there's lots of conditions to be met, but if you find yourself with an early Ludens Echo and a chosen Nami, you can have a field day by playing the two together. Up next, we have Quicksilver coming in at number 8. Really? Quicksilver is only 8th on our list? Yep. While there is a lot of crowd control in the meta, it's becoming less necessary to always grab a Quicksilver for your carry. That doesn't mean you should stop making Quicksilver if you have the option, but you're not going to lose the game instantly if you're unable to secure it. Basically, there's too many ways for ranged carries to get sniped by damage that stopping crowd control is not as important. Items like Guardian Angel are starting to take precedence over Quicksilver for that very reason. It's even popular to focus entirely on damage or utility items to do as much damage as possible instead of running defensive late game focused items. So that's why a relatively important item like Quicksilver isn't lower on the list. It's still a fantastic defensive item and you're going to get a lot of value from using it, but you don't always have to prioritize making it. The next item is Locket of the Iron Solari, which comes in at number 7. Locket is one of those items you can almost always slam early on in the game, and you're gonna get value from doing so. It's definitely not going to do as much later on in the game, but if your goal is to win early rounds, then making an early Locket is a great way to do that. Not everyone is going to make a Locket, as both Rod and Chain Vest can be used elsewhere, but most top players value making early items over anything else. It's one of the best ways to prevent losing too much health. That said, unlike other universally good items, Locket does fall off much harder, which means you only want to make one per game. If you make more than one Locket, you're going to have fewer items that scale well into the mid and late game, so the value you got saving health early will be lost. Overall, Locket is a solid early item, but it isn't as valuable as, say, a Chalice or a Zekes, so while we recommend making this item, it's up to you whether you think it'll be worth it or not. Next up, we have Infinity Edge as the number 6 item for today's list. Infinity Edge is quite possibly the best overall damage item in the game right now. This is because it works on a wide variety of champions, whether that's a backline carry like Ashe, an assassin like Talon, or even magic champions if you're running Jeweled Gauntlet with it. Sure, it can be countered by Bramble Vest, but that's really not going to be too big of a deal, as generally Bramble Vest is only going to be on one champion. There's not really any better choice when it comes to an all-around damage item, as others are relatively specific. Deathblade only goes well for physical damage and requires ramping up in a fight. Giant Slayer is good, but less valuable in a meta where there's not many brawlers being used. This makes Infinity Edge a relatively good item to slam early on in the game, as you're almost always going to end up with a champion to play it on later in the game. Moving right along, let's talk about Morellonomicon, which is the number 5 item on today's list. Okay, Morellonomicon is relatively lackluster compared to other items. The damage isn't really that great, and you have to have a champion that does AoE. Compare that to Sunfire Cape, which gets constant value and can be played on any champion. So why even bother making Morellonomicon? Mainly because there's just really good Morellonomicon holders in the game. Morgana, for example, is really good, but even then, she's not as reliable as, say, Ezreal. Sejuani is one of the best frontliners to give it to, and even champions like Yone can use it well. Basically, there's enough variety in the champions you can give it to that Morellonomicon becomes a more valuable item than it otherwise would be. Because it's good on a lot of champions, it makes it a good item to make early on in the game. Overall, that's what today's list really focuses on. Items that can be made early on and that are still going to be useful later on. Even an item like Morellonomicon, which doesn't do as much damage later on, still gets value from the healing reduction. Our next 2 items are the best utility aura items to make. First up, we have Chalice of Power coming in at number 4. Despite being nerfed in the 1022 hotfix patch, Chalice is still one of the best items in the game. The bonus spell power it provides is useful for a lot of different champions and compositions that you're never going to be in a position where you can't use a Chalice. Keep in mind that spell power works with basically every champion in the game. Even if their damage isn't tied to it, they'll still get some extra bonuses. So that means having Chalice on, say, a Kindred next to an Ashe is still going to give value to the Ashe. Although Chalice is really good throughout the game, it isn't quite as impactful early on. Sure, it's fine to make because you'll get value from it later on, but it's not as valuable early as, say, a Locket. But with how good it is later on in the game, you're not going to be in a bad spot by making it early. The second utility aura item to talk about is Zekes Herald, which comes in at number 3. Zekes, unlike Chalice, is amazing to make early on. In fact, it's possibly the best item to make early game because attack speed does 2 things. It raises the overall damage output of your champions as they'll attack faster, and due to that faster attack, they'll gain mana quicker. This gives a huge advantage at any point in the game, but especially early on when damage and mana gain are slower. And like Chalice, Zekes is valuable for every champion as attack speed is always useful. We highly recommend slamming this item early on if you're able to make it. Next up, we have our number 2 item on today's list, Zz'Rot Portal. Zz'Rot could potentially have been 3rd or even 4th on the list, but if you look at the item trends for top players, you'll notice that Zz'Rot is built a lot. And for good reason. The taunt effect of the item is really useful in a lot of ways. The most obvious way to use Zz'Rot is to give it to your frontline, specifically champions you want casting early on, like Sejuani or Aatrox. The taunt will cause nearby champions to focus on them, and then boom, your champion will cast much earlier on in the fight than normal. The second use of Zz'Rot is to grab assassins after they jump. This can be a great way to protect your backline from getting sniped. Of course, to keep with today's theme, Zz'Rot is also a great item to make early on in the game. The taunt isn't as important in this case, but the minion that it spawns after the unit dies is surprisingly hard to kill and does a lot of damage. Oftentimes, the minion will be the reason why you win those early rounds. And since Zz'Rot gets a lot of value later on, yeah, it's easy to see why making this early on in the game is good. Alright, we're on to our number 1 item for today's list, and that is Guardian Angel. We mentioned Guardian Angel earlier when we went over Quicksilver because really this item is the best defensive item you can make currently. It's useful on a wide variety of champions, whether that's your frontline, a carry, or even an assassin. The fact that essentially having 2 lives for your important champion is always going to be valuable. Another reason as to why Guardian Angel is so good is that it counters Talon quite heavily. Since Talon will go after the unit with the lowest armor, having GA on your carry is often enough to keep it away from Talon. And if he does jump on them, they can just revive afterwards. Guardian Angel is an all-around great defensive item that you can make early on since it goes on practically any champion. That's going to be it for our top 10 items list. But before we go, we have one quick honorable mention to talk about, and that's the spatula. The spatula is always decent depending on the current meta, so we want to highlight a few of its uses in 1023. First is Dusk. Dusk can be hit or miss in the meta, but having a Dusk item makes it a lot easier to run 6 Dusk, which is a powerful 6-piece synergy. In particular, you can run something like Jhin with Dusk, and that way you get 2 carries with Riven covering the magic damage and Jhin covering the physical. Another use of the spatula is to turn a champion into a Warlord. Warlords in most games are not great, but if you can get a chosen Warlord and a spatula item for it, you've got yourself a solid late game comp, especially after the change to Xin Zhao, as he's a solid frontliner for a Warlord build. And the last spatula item to talk about is Divine. Divine got buffed in 1023, and while it may not be the best composition, having a spatula does open up for fun possibilities. For example, you can turn Ashe into a Divine and run her alongside Warwick. Or you can give your Divine spatula to a Yone later on and run Adept with Aurelia and Shen. Basically, you get a lot of really neat options with a Divine spatula. And that's all we have for you today, folks. We really wanted to put an emphasis on items that are playable early on in the game because it's an area that a lot of players don't realize has a lot of impact on the overall game. By making universal items early on, you're not only losing less health, you're also securing a better mid and late game. Let us know in the comment section below what items you're favoring in the current meta. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.